All right. Hi, everyone. So I am the president of Hope Always. So thank you all for coming. I know it was a small group, but we still appreciate your support. So now we're going to start our Q&A panel. Dr. Cardell will be back. He's the vice president of the group. Carla is one of our committee members. Samuel over here is our newest treasurer. And then our secretary had to leave because she pulled an overnighter just to be here today with us. So that's mainly our group. Did I miss anyone?
I don't believe so. Oh, Ruby.
Oh, and then Ruby Johnson. She's also one of our committee members as well. So we'll go ahead and get started with the Q&A if any of you.
Do you have situations where you want to get someone into the hospital because they've admitted being suicidal, but then the hospital doesn't keep them? Because I know that's a frustration.
That is actually a huge frustration. And that's when I was doing my presentation and I said, well, I won't get into what the hospital did because the hospital released that person that said the only logical thing I can think of to do is kill myself, and really had no support, nowhere to go, and the hospital did release them. So yeah, it is a huge frustration, especially when you have a mental health professional that does a Title 25, and a Title 25 is a mandatory hold, and then they don't honor that mandatory hold. So yes, huge frustration.
Yeah, or getting people into a professional in a reasonable amount of time. Like the other lady, Donnell, was talking about having something lined up when prisoners get out. And it's not always easy to get someone in to see anybody.
You're correct, it isn't, and we're finding more and more because every place is short-staffed. So we've been trying to get another therapist, not a new therapist, but we've been trying to get another therapist for over a year. We have had 80 referrals for behavioral health services since January. We have 3 therapists who are all full to capacity, and then we have 1 full-time and 1 part-time, psychiatric nurse practitioner to be able to prescribe medications, so psychotropic medications. And our referral coordinator is like, what do I do? I said, I don't know, I'm completely full. And then I feel like I can't say, I can take more people on because literally this week in our team meeting, we meet every Wednesday. I said, well, I think I can take 3 new people on because I'm gonna have 3 people drop off because they're all moving. And within a day and a half, I had 3 people who hadn't seen me in over a year. Actually, no, I take that back. 5 people who have not come to see me in over a year that all have said, I want to come back into services. So I said, yeah, nope, I can't take any new patients on because I have all of these ones that came back. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Is there any hope that they're going to get an influx of counselors or?
We can always hope. People going to school and getting their license and being able to. And when COVID was here, you could go to Colorado, you could go to these other places and via the internet get help. But I've made it very clear. I've had some people that have said, hey, I'm going to be moving to Colorado, or I'm going to be moving to Florida, or the 3 people that are actually moving, one wants to move to Arizona, one's going to move to Colorado, and one's going to move, she already left to the East Coast. And I said, I'm not licensed in those states, so I cannot follow you, but I will help you find mental health services for those places. So, yeah.
So do you see a huge increase in mental illness these days?
It's always been there, but like I had said, through COVID, we saw an increase of anxiety and depression, huge, and more with suicidal ideations we've seen. But again, that trend was in an uptick before COVID hit, and then COVID just more put a magnifying glass on it.
Okay. Do you see it as a spiritual battle?
I see a lot of things as a spiritual battle. It absolutely is. And I know that some people have said some of the mental illnesses might be a form of possession. And haven't seen like that as much, but I also know that we don't see a lot of it with medications. So I think that we would see a lot more of that if we didn't have medications. Just like when Dr. Sleeth was talking about, we would see more completed suicides if we didn't have medical intervention. But I have seen demonic possession, and it is frightening.
It's terrifying.
Yes.
Well, and
Yes.
don't drugs open you up to that?
Drugs, like not prescription
No,
drugs.
no, I'm
Yeah.
talking illicit.
Yeah, illicit drugs, absolutely, Bill. But it also opens up, and we're seeing this more and more with marijuana use. I don't know if you guys are seeing that, but with marijuana use, the marijuana psychosis, and especially in younger kids where they're like, well, marijuana's great, it's fine. But one of our psychiatric nurse practitioners, she's like, half of the kids that I'm seeing that are saying, well, I'm experiencing this psychosis, or like I'm seeing things or I'm hearing things. And she's like, how much marijuana are you using? And they're like, well, like daily. So how about you stop and we'll see what happens? And I mean, because as was mentioned earlier, the brain is still developing until 25. And so it's bringing it out, but they're finding that more and more, and they're doing more studies on that, but huge thing with that.
Also, I've seen on my side of things, pastors still against psych meds. It's like, well, if you believe strong enough, you're not going to need those. And I've heard that. It's like, no, there has to be a point where you say you need more than just counseling. So
I'm
is that
thankful.
just education?
Yeah. I'm really thankful that my pastor is not one of them. My pastor's like, medications are good, stay on them. But I've also been under his tutelage for over 18 years, and he knows what I do. But I've also had people in the church, and I'm like, don't ever go to that person for advice again. So I've had some of my clients come to services. There's a fine line there, and I don't invite them, but if they come, I'm not going to be like, get out of my church, because we're a rural community, right? So you have those dual relationships. Well, one of our well-meaning church members told one of my patients, who I'm like, this person can never, ever, ever be off medications, that if you prayed hard enough, God would take that away. And I'm like, I love her, but please don't ever listen to her. And please don't stop taking your medication without talking to your doctor first, please. And I've tried to do some of that education too. Like, we wouldn't tell a cancer patient, stop taking those medications, stop going in for chemo treatment, because if you pray hard enough, and I do believe that, and he is the great physician, and God can do anything. There is nothing that he cannot do, but he also gave us that medication. He also gave us the doctors to help out with that. So it is a balance there, and just an education and help. But yeah, so sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. I'm like, I feel like I'm on one here. So yeah. So yeah.
In the talks earlier today, there was various mentions to stigmas, biases, and I don't know, there's a couple other words that fit that category that I can't think of right now. Are we starting to see any sign that rolling stone is slowing down, that it is better to talk and all that? And like the gentleman that was here during the last Q&A about what happened with his daughter, because he mentioned, yes, I may be a grandpa, because with that, getting older, there's a stigma. I don't know what the kids are going through today, da-da-da-da-da, and I don't. I do my best to care, though. I mean, because I try to, what if the shoe is on the other foot? And just best practices? Are things slowly changing? I mean, yes, this is Wyoming, this is cowboy up. But at times I would also respond, some of the worst injuries I've seen cowboys have coming from an agricultural background, no one ever saw.
Anybody else want to take this? Because I definitely have an answer, but I don't want to keep talking, like take over this whole thing. So yes, we are seeing it being destigmatized, but very, very slowly. And like as I said, like even with those celebrities, Michael Phelps is a huge one because he talks about depression, right? And you're like, wait, you've won all these, gold medals. You're like this amazing athlete, and you suffer with depression. We also see it in a lot of heroes of the faith, too. And that sermon that I listened to yesterday, and I'm going to admit it took me 2.5 hours to watch a 40-minute sermon because I'm taking notes. I'm like, this is amazing. But he talked about, and I didn't even realize this, Martin Luther. Martin Luther really had a lot of bouts and struggles with depression. And he had even... his family got to the point when he would go into the house and he had one of his bouts with depression, they would get everything sharp out of the house because they thought he was going to kill himself. And so you look at a hero of the faith like that, or Charles Spurgeon. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Charles Spurgeon, but he's another one who really struggled with depression. And for them to be able to be open and honest about that and say, yes, I struggle with that, I think that helps in faith communities as well, as the general population too. But when you have celebrities behind it, the general population seem to follow that, and especially celebrities that they admire, right? But we still see it hugely stigmatized even with that. And I don't know if anybody else has any other.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love about mental health first aid and doing that training is it looks at the stigma. And we talk in that class about how do we address the stigma with this, especially in law enforcement, right? We talked about the masculine, I don't have emotions type of mindset that a lot of law enforcement can have. But it looks at using person first language and being very mindful about the language that you use. And then applying that to your conversations. I'm working on a paper right now about the way that even behavioral health providers, in my meetings with different behavioral health providers, the comments they make, well, it's just behavioral. I'm sorry, what? That behavior, all behavior is purposeful and motivated by something. And addressing that and addressing how we speak and how we talk about the people that are dealing with mental illness is really important. And I think the stigma is slowly changing, very slowly changing. But I think the younger generation, maybe one of the benefits of social media is having more connection and being able to have more conversations about some of these things that maybe are a little too uncomfortable to have face-to-face, but over the internet, okay, that's a little easier. So it can kind of open up some doors that way.
So I would agree that the stigma itself, or at least the idea of mental health as being stigmatized is becoming more of a socially acceptable, right? Don't suffer in silence, reach out for help, it's okay to not be okay. We hear a lot of these things, and there are multiple, so we have Hope Always Wyoming for this region wanting to address not just mental health and suicide, but also that spiritual side of things. When we're, from my own experience and then in dealing with other organizations, different groups, it was mentioned earlier, one of the biggest things when we see people who are really struggling, at least again from my experience, is there is really a lack of sense of self and purpose. So people become hopeless, very, very depressed, anxious, unsure of the future, and then very isolated. Again, living in this region, from what I see in my own practice, I have noticed that the age range between about 13 to 17 due to social media. There's a lot of kids who are almost shamed into reaching out for help due to maybe some online bullying. Now, I will say if more resources were available for online platforms for kids to have peer support, I think that would be very beneficial. I'm not personally sure of any, but I do unfortunately know of a couple kids recently who did take their own lives. And when the parents and law enforcement did look through their social media account, the amount of other kids essentially taunting them to do it was pretty mind-blowing. So I think with that too, we live in a very, very digital age, digital culture where a lot of this trolling and bullying can take place, where people are saying things to other people that they would not dare say face to face. And yet there's also this sense of isolation or whatever when someone looks at their screen and begins to take these things in very personally, whittles away at their self-worth. And then, again, the spiritual side of things, regardless of what people's real beliefs are, is when you start losing touch with, say, your maker, your creator, right? For here we would say with God and with Jesus. As a culture, society-wide, we see this shift happening where more and more people falling away, and there is just kind of a generalized hopelessness. Now coming out of the pandemic, we see more and more people realizing how depressing and anxiety-inducing this really was. But then, as a culture, even prior to that, there was this underlying tension that I think is always there, and now people are hopefully shifting towards reaching out for more, not just physical health, right, going to their doctor for the aches and pains in this, but stress management, wellness, and again, dealing with mental health issues. So, and it takes a team approach. I do not believe personally that, just as was mentioned earlier, just going to church is going to help someone who's truly, truly struggling. Will it help? Yes. But you couple that with a good counselor, a good mental health worker who understands whatever this person may be going through, someone who has a good social network around other healthy people, recovery programs offered through Volunteers of America, Celebrate Recovery, AA, whatever it may be, where people can get support for whatever it is they're really struggling with. Again, multifaceted sort of approach to many things, so which will help even decrease that more, hopefully. So. I guess one more thing on that. Since we are in Wyoming, we do talk about the cowboy up sort of mentality around here. Part of that is going by the wayside, but I do still think that there's quite a few people who are either don't know how to reach out for help or really are afraid to, are really, quite honestly, more afraid to reach out and ask for help than whatever it is they're dealing with. So I think part of what we would like to do is Hope Always Wyoming, and just like multiple organizations around this community, right, with the hospital CRMC, the Sheriff's Department, Grace for Two Brothers. I think all of us have a common goal of wanting to help people not take their own life and to help address these, life is tough, again, no matter what your belief is. So the goal for us, I guess, or an objective would be to become a resource hub for being able to pool all of these different resources together as like a centralized place of, I'm struggling with drug and alcohol dependency maybe. Here are the groups that can help with that. I need a good counselor. I would like a faith-based counselor. I'm not sure what I want. I just want to talk to someone. Here's a person from maybe community group or church. But the goal being to help start breaking these things down, and that we as a community can communicate a little bit more efficiently so that it is not just well, these guys are doing this, but these guys are trying to do the same thing, and no one's talking with each other. I don't know how beneficial that really is for a community as a whole. So that is somewhat the objective for Hope Always Wyoming. Yes, we are a faith-based, biblical-based, Christ-centered organization, but with the same goal of wanting to address these very real problems head on with the help of other people. So. Any other questions?
I guess a follow-up to your just last bit about, Organization A here is doing this, and Organization B's pretty much doing the same thing, but they may not necessarily be, I won't say talking to each other, but just, is Wyoming, I mean, we're here in Cheyenne, but is Cheyenne or just Wyoming in general getting better on being more efficient with resources or stuff like that? Because, I mean, I definitely want to be part of the solution, but I know I am not the solution. So,
From what I can see, not particularly, a little bit. It really depends on, again, like all things, communication. But there are, again, isolated, I don't want to say isolated pockets, that doesn't really make sense. But I think people are starting to come together more, reaching out more through various organizations, again, with a common goal. I would say throughout the state of Wyoming as a whole, things are still pretty, again, we're within our own communities. That makes most people are still like hometown stuff, and that's pretty much where it stays. And in a lot of these rural areas, there just are not resources available for people. I mean, aside from online, but even a lot of the online things, you can go online, and my goodness, you have thousands of options of various things to choose from. So again, we would like to try to see how much of what in this region and within the state can we pull together into one centralized location that can, if someone, say, out, we'll use Lusk as an example, someone who's maybe suffering, going through something out there, can they find a resource still within the state for someone who understands the dynamic and the lifestyle of people who live out here? I would say it's still a work in progress, but I will let someone else.
I think it's getting better, the communication. One of the goals of the sheriff and of the chief deputy who oversees the detention center was to start bringing in these other organizations and these other community services and starting to have meetings and say, hey, here's what we're seeing in here. What are you guys seeing out there? And how can we work together to create a solution within our community, right? Because we don't have the resources. I heard, the conversation about the hospital, and that is a frustration. We don't have, where I lived in Pennsylvania, there was 15 psychiatric inpatient facilities within a 10-mile radius that you could send someone to. If you needed, if you didn't have a bed at this one, they would have a bed at this one. And we just don't have that network here. We just don't have those resources. And so I think the communication between organizations is imperative to getting people services and getting them the help they need before they need a crisis bed. And that, I think, is getting better, but I think we still have a long way to go. I know we recently had a meeting with one of the Supreme Court justices of Wyoming, and they are working on this pilot program to try and help those with mental illness. And how do we keep low-level misdemeanor crimes out of jail and get them into services? So, but it's in the infancy of that, and it just takes time. But there are people that are starting to say, hey, this is a problem, and what do we have to do to fix it? So.
at the risk of following up on that, because you mentioned, 15 facilities within a 10-mile radius, and my mind thinks 10-mile radius, that's Archer. But but you also mentioned your background coming from Pennsylvania. And I guess this would be a question for everyone in general. Is Wyoming, and the communication aspect, becoming more open for ideas from other places? Because you bring some experience from Pennsylvania, obviously urban and rural. Our urban is probably rural to you, and no one, just different. No one's at fault on that. But is Wyoming slowly becoming more open to, we're seeing things that worked in other places, Philadelphia, Omaha, Portland, pick one, Oregon or Maine, and all that? Is Wyoming starting to become more, because some people, at times Wyoming seems to have the stigma that no one else knows how Wyoming lives. How much of a hindrance has that been, and are we working through that?
That is one of those questions where I think, again, culturally out here, just like any part of the country, right, we definitely have our own culture, and just, down here in the southern part of the state is actually culturally different than the northern part of the state. However, I think some of, again, the if you will, cowboy way, the grit, and just the rural lifestyle is very different from the urban sort of hustle and bustle, right? Ranching, especially cattle ranching, things like that is a very different life and very hard work. I do think why most people in Wyoming, however, are pretty open by and large to receiving, especially when it's coming for help and resources. I think where sometimes the stigma would come from, maybe, as the old saying goes, one bad apple ruins the pie, where there may be pockets of just, I don't know if it's an older generation or just very determined sort of character, personality styles, that may make it appear as though everyone out here is just a rough and tumble, nothing, bothers them sort of person. But I don't necessarily think that's obviously that doesn't describe everyone who lives in the great state of Wyoming. And there is, unfortunately, just by giving the statistics and everything we have talked about, there are a lot of people suffering here in this state. The dynamics behind it, no one really knows. Isolation is a big part of it, the rural nature of how people live. I honestly think from a cultural standpoint, with the internet and TV and things, kids growing up who may view themselves as being in more like poverty and not having the glitzy, glamorous looking sort of maybe lifestyle of someone living in the big city or in a beachfront area. We have the ocean of prairie that we live in here. And I do think that can play on people's psyche, especially from a young age, when we're talking about things of like envy, jealousy, that sense of self-worth. Some of that can play into that, and again, loneliness. If you are someone perhaps who is a little bit more open to various things, but again, you live in a community that this is how it's always been and how it will always be, there's inevitably going to be conflict, unfortunately. I would say, though, by and large, most people throughout the state are becoming more open to the idea of addressing things, because at some point, enough people I don't think there isn't a single person in the state that has not been affected in some way by either suicide or someone they know, someone struggling pretty heavily with some sort of mental or emotional disorder of some sort. Not to make it sound like everyone in the state is completely emotionally dysregulated or crazy, but again, the population and again, statistically speaking, that I think more people are turning towards why do we have this problem and how do we address it, and thus bringing in multiple agencies, people, and things to do to try to address these things. So. Still, I would say throughout the state, a bit of an uphill battle, for sure.
I will say too that the governor is working on, he has some type of program that he does for suicide. I don't know how big it is right now. I do know he's aware of it, so he's been working, I think, over the past couple of years as governor towards helping in the suicide prevention. So I know our government is working towards it. It's just slow.
Yeah, continuing on that point with the government, the Wyoming Department of Health, that's who trained me for the suicide prevention. They had, I don't know if they had a grant or if they had money set aside for training, but they were training clinicians and people all across the state to start getting resources and getting help out there. And the mental health first aid program is a fairly expensive program to be trained in. So having the state offer that to people really did help them get it to places that otherwise would not have had access to it. When I did my training, there was people in Lander, there was people with the Wyoming Department of Corrections, all over the state. So, and I think, I can only speak from the perspective of Cheyenne. I think we are starting to be more accepting of kind of other ideas, especially, we're kind of like this melting pot of people from all over the place. The number of times that I drive around and I see different license plates from different areas. I know our new administrator had reached out to other jails across the country to say, hey, what's going well, what's going wrong, what can we learn from you guys? So.
Well, I guess if there's no other questions, then thank you again for coming. Also, thank you to our guest speakers for speaking for us, especially to a small group. But it was good, even if we got just one person, which we did. So thank you for that, for coming, and thank you for your support. And we do plan on doing a conference hopefully next year, but we'll let more details come later. So thank you.